Jerry.
Thank you very much, George. So yeah, the title of my presentation is Window on the Past, Preserving Africa's Ancient Rock Art. I'm going to start by showing rock art from around the world. I've been working specifically with rock art in Africa, but I want to give an idea of the humanity of rock art because it is something that's found on every continent. Then I'm going to just sort of do a part about rock art is amazing, and then I'll get into the preservation, what I've been doing in terms of preservation. So I think let's get going. George mentioned World Heritage Sites, and I think you're familiar with UNESCO World Heritage Sites. There are 1,223 World Heritage Sites. 48 of them are specifically related to rock art. He did mention also I'm a part of this rock art network, which was created by the Getty Conservation Institute. Just last year was formally created, and I'm on the founding board of that rock art network's professionals, rock art professionals from around the world. In fact, many of the first images have been contributed by these friends and colleagues, and I'll be reading what they say about that rock art. So I'm going to start with Altamira. This might be a site you've heard of before in Spain, and I'm going to read what the curator of that site has written. The caves of Altamira offer an exceptionally and diverse monograph of Upper Paleolithic rock art. We find all the themes of Paleolithic art represented, mostly animals, abstract signs, and human representation through hands. With all the techniques, engravings, drawings, and paintings, and with a variety of styles that a chronological span of more than 30 millennia imposes. Their meaning, although unknown, refers to the symbolic thought of the hunter-gatherer groups who made them. The rock art from Spain dates from, she says 30 millennia, so 30,000, created between 30,000 and 16,000 years. When we speak about rock art, it is paintings and engravings on stones. So I showed you just now the paintings. Here's an example of engraving, and this is from Norway. And again, I'm reading what my colleague has written. The rock art scene depicts a Stone Age reindeer hunt made between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago. It is most likely made by hammer and chisel with indirect technique, and in this ideal light, early in the morning, the peck and marks stand out clearly. The scene is from a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Alta, Norway. Chauvet might be another cave that you're familiar with in France. Discovered in 1994, some of the oldest and most sophisticated and some of the best preserved. These 36,000-year-old paintings reflecting the art. On the one corner of the wall, a composition is centered by 4 horse heads around which other species are organized in a circular movement. We see rhinos and aurochs, which of course aurochs are completely disappeared around the world. Rhinos, of course, we no longer find in Europe. So it's also an important historic document of life 36,000 years ago in Europe. And you can see, well, maybe just a little bit more about this. I mean, the spiritual value, if you can imagine, because this is a cave. It means you had to go in hundreds, maybe in a half mile into this space with what kind of lighting did they have, with torches or something, and then to paint something this intricate and this with showing so much emotion and what you can feel like you feel like the horses themselves are moving, and maybe that was the intent, was to show movement of the horses, painted with charcoal, using a kind of brush. These are in charcoal. So just imagine the effort that has gone into making them. They weren't doing a land, looking at the horse and painting it. They brought the spirit of the animal into the cave as they painted it. And here in the United States, the Pecos River style paintings are found in lower Pecos Canyonlands of southwest Texas and Coahuila, Mexico. These complex pictorial narratives communicate that are all still recognizable to indigenous peoples today. They're ambitious in scale, spanning as much as 150 meters in length and 15 meters in height, many of which were painted during a single painting session. Radiocarbon dating of the pictographs demonstrate that the mural production began around 6,000 years ago and lasted for 4,000 years. Also in the United States, Rochester Creek panel in Emery County, Utah, thought to be primarily from the Fremont culture. This panel also has archaic images and more Utah motifs. The panel overlooks the confluence of Muddy Creek and the Rochester Canyon. This figure and the next one were contributed by friend Stephen Alvarez, who has created something called the Ancient Art Archive. And I encourage you to look up their website. He's an amazing photographer and has captured amazing scenes of rock art, mainly in the Americas. And this next image is also from him, Petroglyph Beach, a spiral engraving at Petroglyph Beach, Wrangell Island in Alaska. Petroglyph Beach is a well-known Tlingit rock art site at the head of Wrangell Island. For the Tlingit, the site reinforces their long history on the island. And we'll come back to this. We'll see this spiral motif so common to cultures around the world. Also in the United States and California, again, I'm reading from the person who's taken the image and who's worked with these rock art sites. Rain shaman motif from the Coso Range, Eastern California. This figure is shown with a quail top-knot feather headdress, the characteristic headgear of weather shamans. He also wears a ritual tunic which would have been made of hide and painted with geometric patterns shown here. Which are his signs of supernatural power, which he had witnessed in vision from which he obtained this power. His face is a concentric circle which symbolizes the whirlwind, which carries shamans into their supernatural domain. And the last image from rock art outside of Africa, and this is in fact the oldest known rock art. So over 51,000 years old, 51,000 years. Today I went to the ancient Spanish monastery, which, 400 or 500 years, ancient. This is really ancient to me. So this is just, again, a recent discovery, the last 10 years, and just been published. And we see this kind of pig that you no longer find around. There are other mystical images here too. This is the technique that you see here, something called de-stretch, which pulls out colors and things we don't see with our human eye. But this there's a way of pulling out these other what you can't see with human eyes. You see the hand stencil there, again, another very common thing with rock art around the world. So now I'm taking you to Africa, which is where I'm more specialized. And we believe that rock art occurs in most African countries, with more concentrations we see through the Sahara and in southern Africa. We can't imagine that there was more rock art in the Central Africa, but it's a very tropical climate, which means its preservation of paintings is challenging. And whereas in the Sahara, the dry climate and so on. And then the rock art tradition in paintings in Southern Africa continued until just a few hundred years ago. Question we often have is how old is the rock art? In Africa, the earliest known paintings were found here. It's called the Apollo 11 cave. Looking at the crowd here, I think most of us were around in 1969 when Apollo 11 made its historic voyage. So this was plaquettes, we call them, which were found inside a cave. They weren't still on the wall, they were found on the ground. And we were able to put them together and able to date them to around 27,000 years. So this, in Africa, at the moment, this is the oldest known rock art painting. Just to give another example, so this is an engraving, as I mentioned, rock art paintings and engravings, 10,000 years old in Libya. This engraving is called the Fighting Cats. And again, we don't really know what these mystical creatures are. They look like cats to us. They look like they're fighting, which is an interesting detail, sort of like the umbilical cords of these two beast with ostriches on it. Again, what does it mean? We don't know, but it's an interesting sight anyway. In here too, I mean, is this art? It's a small stone called the Blombos stone, again, discovered in the Blombos cave, estimated to be 77,000 years old. With the schematic engraving on it, which in most people's mind represents humans' thought. Something was going on when whoever the man or the woman did that was thinking something, was representing something in that. So like all art, is it art? Was it intentionally made as art? Anyway, this can also be considered ancient African rock art. So then where is rock art found? I showed you a map before, but I'm just going to take you on a tour of rock art around the continent. Beginning in Morocco, we call this Tazina style engravings. The area is known as Tazina. And you find a lot of these types of engravings around 5,000 or 6,000 years old. Niger is one of my favorite places to visit and the most impressive area I've been in to see things. Wari, I mean, these are also called tulip head engravings for obvious reasons. These are a bit more recent, maybe around 2,000 years old. In Algeria, this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. These paintings estimated to be around 9,000 years old. Also in Algeria, again, this is called the Great God of Sefar. Sefar is the name of the location. Great God, yeah, it does. We don't know why it was painted like this, but it does give the idea of a powerful being, some sort of power emanating from this image. And it's about 3 meters high, so it's not a small image. Still in Algeria, this is maybe about this large. So not very large, but you can just see the details. So these were not people doing just scratching in the stone. They had intent when they were doing this. This image features on the Algerian money. What tools did they use as a question? Probably hard stones. I mean, in some areas we have found the tools they've used, sharp stones, and maybe with another like hammer to use that to make them fine, because you see they've been engraved and then rubbed maybe with a softer stone and polished and so on like that. This is called the Crying Cows, just part of a large panel. Also, again, believed to be around 5,000 or 6,000 years old. When the Sahara was green, this is something I've learned as I began working with rock art. The Sahara was green for about 5,000 years, between 13,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago. There was a period of heavy monsoons that turned the desert green, so that it brought life, it brought animals, wildlife, and it's actually through the rock art that we're able to understand a lot about the climate and what was happening, life and animal life in the Sahara at that time. The crying cows, you can see it. It does appear very much like there are tears coming out of those cows' eyes. Why? We're not sure. The guide who took us here said when it does, there are occasional times when it rains. And when it rains, there is a pool that is created in front of this panel. So perhaps there was a time when that pool disappeared and the people who were used to seeing it, just one conjecture of why these cows are crying. But again, you can just see the beauty of the engraving and the care that was taken to make it. Still in Algeria, you could think this is perhaps Matisse. But yeah, Matisse 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. Going to Somaliland, which is a part of Somalia, so on the east of Africa. We went to this site about 15 years ago. And you see this image. Cow is another thing that's widely represented in rock art throughout Africa. But just how it is depicted is so interesting. Again, we're talking 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, also for the dating of this painting. And the human figure there. So many questions. One of the things I love about my work is that, one of the frustrating things, but the thing that I love too, is that you don't know what they were expressing. So you're forced to think about it. Why is there no head to the cow? Is that the head there? What are these stripes on the neck? Who knows? Because I don't know of any cows that look like that. And then this human who appears to be wearing very stylish clothes. So what was he or she wearing, and why are they standing like this underneath the cows? Images have the human beings placed around the cow at different places. Going to Egypt, Cave of the Hands. You may be familiar with the Cave of the Swimmers. You saw the English Patient, the movie The English Patient. There's a scene from that movie where they're in this cave in the Egyptian desert, in a cave with what looked like swimmers. And the Cave of the Hands is in that same site of the swimmers. So dated between, I don't remember now, but I'm going to say like around 3,000 years ago. Here you see in the lower corner there too, the hand stencil, so common with rock art around the world. And usually you do see hands painted, but usually it is stencil painted, which means they put paint in their mouth, maybe with a straw. I'm going to take you to South Africa, Cedarburg. And here too, we have the D-stretch, which gives us a better idea of what we're seeing here in the right part of the panel there. And these are probably shamans in this orange sort of cloak with probably beads, some sort of beading covering their faces. And yeah, what they were doing, we're not sure, but probably some sort of ritual. Chad, this is actually my favorite engraving throughout the continent, which is why I wanted my picture with them, but also just to give an idea of the scale. It's often referred to as Nyola Doa, which in the local language means beautiful are the big ladies. But after having visited the site a couple of times and seeing similar engravings, I'm not at all convinced that they're ladies. We look at their form, yeah, you might think the buxom hips and so on, that ladies, but I'm not sure. Again, we left there, and here, just the next slide just shows a bit more of the detail of these engravings, which must have had great significance.
No breasts. I'm not seeing any breasts on
Yeah, exactly. So again, why I'm not convinced that they're ladies. So,
what year do you think?
uh, either 3,000 or 5,000, thousands of years anyway. I'm pretty sure 5,000. Yeah. So these are, yeah, in the middle of the desert. So just to give you a little context too, when I talk about going, when we go to record and document these sites, what does that mean? So we spend, in this particular case in Chad, you arrive in the capital city in N'Djamena. You spend 2 days on the road to get to the site. And here we're a caravan, you can see 6 or 7 vehicles there. And what we used to do as well to help finance our trips, because nobody's handing out money for rock art and preservation in general. It's always a challenge. So, this is a pretty exclusive opportunity for people. So we get like 4 people to pay $15,000 to come with us, which would help to finance our documentation trip and also to finance the organization to do our other activities. So we have, a couple of cars just for the vehicles, 2 carloads carrying the food that you need to carry, because in the desert you're not going to find any food or even water, carrying fuel and so on. And then, of course, we have security wherever we go as well. So, but you can see it's a long journey, but it's amazing. So I feel very fortunate to have been able. Well, I mean, the real cost is going to be still going to be around at least $5,000. So then we would add on top of that $10,000, for example, just to.
That's just for one site, or is that
That's like a 2-week journey to many different sites. A tour, yeah. And again, just to give an idea of the landscape that we go through to get to these sites. So you don't see many roads. So it's taxing on your body to get there, but you're in awe of what you're seeing as well. So back to what rock art can tell us about the past, what it helps to inform us about the past. I mentioned before, so the climate there are moments of change. So this is in the Sahara. Crocodiles, you find crocodiles, hippos, water animals where there's no longer water. So it helps to date this engraving. I mean, you can already tell from the weathering of the stone, but also we know that crocodiles have not been in the Sahara probably for the past 5,000 years. So we know this engraving is at least 5,000 years old. Elephants as well in Libya. You don't find elephants in the desert anymore. But there is also more recent rock art. So this is in South Africa, and we call this contact art. So Bushman paintings of the Boer, the Dutch, when they were arriving, the settlers, when they were arriving in I want to say the 1600s. So it's a different kind of record than the books we read and so on. But it's still a record, a historic record. Bushman painting of a galleon in the Cape. In Algeria, this rock art can give us an idea of when horses maybe were brought into the continent, when wheels or chariots came from Egypt into the continent. It helps us learn about migration of camels, when they arrived and so on. So these are different things we can learn from rock art. Symbolism, because often even already what we've looked at, again, these weren't artists looking at a landscape and recording something. Everything we've looked at so far has some meaning, some symbolism. So just, this is a common thing. We've seen spirals, concentric circles. This is in Uganda. Not that old, maybe 600 or 700 years old. But again, just how common it is to find this type of imagery. in Kenya on an island in Lake Victoria. The people who live there now, the Suba people who live there now, definitely did not paint this. This predates the people who live on the island now, but they've appropriated it, and they have their stories to tell about what this means to them. And it has to do with the seasons, when the rains are going to arrive, how you use the rock art to control the weather. So not just to bring rain when you want it, but maybe to stop the rain from watering your enemies' fields, so on. So there's a lot of mythology related to this type of imagery. I talk about giraffe. The giraffe is the most common animal you see in rock art in Africa. And I have about 5 examples of it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about why people think the giraffe is so widely represented. So this is in Algeria. And here too, you can see, and this is not the only place where you see it's like somebody holding the tongue. It appears to be holding the giraffe's tongue. Also in Niger, also cattle there too. I mean, that's something you see quite often with cattle is holding on to the tail of a cow. In Namibia, what this appears, and this maybe gives more of an idea of why we think giraffe is so common. If you look closely, maybe it's maybe a bit hard to tell, but the giraffe's head appears to be above the clouds. And it appears like there's rain coming down over the giraffe's head. The giraffe is the tallest mammal on Earth, which means it's the one that's closest to the clouds. And we know the controlling of the weather is something that's important for even today. How can we get the rains to come? How can we stop the rains from coming? So controlling weather has always been an important thing. And finding what we call them rain animals, or different rain animals, but probably the giraffe, one reason it could be so common is that it was a rain animal that had a special meaning for being able to control the rains. Again, so we've been all over the continent here in Zimbabwe, giraffes. Back in Niger, this is probably one of the least, maybe in a way, least artistic. You've seen in the other engravings, how they pay a little bit more attention to the detail, the giraffe patterns. And in fact, this is my other favorite rock art site, the Dabous giraffe in Dabous in central Niger. 8,000 years old, life-size giraffes from head to toe. And here too, you see that there wasn't just somebody scraping away. There was real intent in creating this giraffe, these giraffe engravings. What you can't see very well, maybe in a little bit here, is that there appears to be some sort of harness coming from the giraffe's nozzle. Well, if you can maybe see it a little bit, I don't know how far over here I can walk. You can see it coming down there too, and there are humans holding on to it. So were humans trying to domesticate the giraffe? Possibly. Were they trying to, maybe more possibly, I think, is they're trying to control the power of the giraffe. Again, this tall mammal that you see wherever you are, more than any other animal, you see the giraffe. So it must have had some, very important symbolic meaning to the people who engraved it. And this, so just to bring us back, this is this is a picture from Kenya that I took in Kenya, just to remind us, what giraffe, this is a Maasai giraffe, so the pattern is a little bit different than other giraffes. But just, again, if you compare to what we've been looking at, they're pretty realistic representations. And I've put this word that I've just learned in the last month, imperium, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it too. It sort of has a celestial meaning, having to do with heavens. And again, why I bring it with the draft, because again, it not only is it closest to the clouds, but in most religions around the world, there's some idea of a heaven above, way up there. And again, could it be that the giraffe is the animal that's closest to those heavens, not just to the rain clouds, but to the heavens? So that's when I want to talk about symbolism, okay? Because again, what we're seeing engraved, yeah, sometimes it may be representational. Here are warriors, here's people doing something, but more often than not, it's representing something that we can only speculate what it actually means or why it was done. So threats, in terms of threats, if rock art has something common around the world, is that it is threatened by natural factors and by human factors. And I'll just get into some of those. So natural, in Morocco, here's an example, exposed to weathering. In the desert, the temperature can change quite drastically between night and day, the wind, the sand, the heat. So this is a common natural threat. In the example in Angola, this type of stone, it's very fragile to begin with, and then just the exposure to the sun, and unfortunately people walking on it as well doesn't really help to preserve it. This is an example in Chad, the animals. So birds build their nests there, mud wasps build their nests. These are hard to protect against. The resources aren't there. These sites are remote. And then more common are threats, human threats. This is a couple of examples in Tanzania. It's a World Heritage Site, Kondoa there. Tanzania was a German colony. And so people thought at a certain point that the Germans were using the rock art as a place to hide their treasures, to hide their gold. And so it became common in recent times for people to look for those treasures using dynamite to blow up the sites and look for these treasures, which of course never existed. And the damage, of course, is long-term and often irreversible. Quarrying, it's rock art, so there are rocks. People need rocks to construct and so on. So it's a common problem is rock quarrying. Here's another example in Kenya. This is soapstone in an area called Kisii. And we were able to record things. We'd hoped we were dealing with the owner. It's on private land. We were dealing with the owner to try and find some, agreement where we could give him money to preserve it and somehow, but he was too impatient. He wanted his money. And so, from one day to the next, he came and they were tearing out the soapstone to make, it's used for enamel, apart from creating other things, but in this particular case, being brought to a factory to make paint enamel. Yeah. Farming. This is an example in Nigeria where I've done quite a bit of work. And this is maybe one of the harder types of threats to deal with, because you never want to have to put a person in a position where they have to decide, do I save the heritage or do I feed my family? Here, the problem that won't surprise you too much. Rock art is an attraction. And they're in sites. Again, they're often remote sites. You can't station a person there to keep guard, 24 hours a day. So really, the graffiti, it's really about raising awareness and appreciation of this art form and its value, cultural, social values, and economic values if it can be part of rock art tourism. But I'd say our premise, but really my premise is that building these barriers, gates, fences, and walls, from my point of view, it's neither efficient, practical, or appropriate to protect the sites. especially if there's a community living there who's been connected to that site for centuries maybe. And then all of a sudden you build this barrier to the site. They may no longer feel an attachment to the site. So they're no longer going to be in the front line to protect the site. So that's why I say often, I mean, they're ugly to start with. So when you go to visit, it takes away the aesthetic value, and often not efficient either. So I mean, even in this case in Nigeria, I mean, they've cut in there and they've gone inside the site. You can't see it here, but another common thing to do is to peck at the painting. If it's a painting site, they would peck the paint, turn it into a powder, and feed it maybe to their animals so that their animals would be more productive. That is my in terms of conservation, I think we have to be very careful about the types of barriers we build. And I would often say that, if the best defense is if people living on or near rock art sites, if there's a spiritual link to the site and or they perceive economic or social benefits from the site. That's one of your best protections, having community there as your front line. We love this heritage, so we're going to be there to protect it. And then just giving an example, case study of Bakor monoliths in Cross River. This is in Nigeria, an U.S. Ambassadors Fund project that I managed from 2018 to 2020. Monoliths, so these type of rock art. Again, these are not, they're older than the ancient Spanish monastery, but not as old as some of the other art we've seen. Probably between 500 and 800 years old, these monoliths. And we know that they have spiritual meaning to the communities that still live around there, where you can see that. This is an initiation site, so they dress them sometimes, they paint them sometimes, they put hats on and lids, they pour libations on them. Of course, from a conservation point of view, we know that affects that heritage. At the same time, it's the fact that monument, that heritage still has meaning to the people, that they're going to protect it. So the challenge of finding that balance of, letting people interact and make sure that heritage is still alive, but in a way that's not too destructive. So an interesting thing that has come out of this project is when we were documenting the rock art in 2016, we documented this base of a monolith. And then doing research, we discovered, we saw that this was the bottom part of this monolith that had been documented in the 1960s. So we knew that the top was somewhere. Well, guess where it is? In the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They were, I have to say, they were gracious enough to let us come in and do 3D documentation of that, so that we were able to put the monolith back together, a facsimile. And I work with an organization called Factum Foundation, located in Spain and London, who does this as their work, recreation, 3D recreation, facsimiles of art that's often been lost. So this is one example of what we've done with our 3D documentation and recreation. So it's in a community museum where it came from, in this village in Nigeria, in southeastern Nigeria. So at the moment, the top is still in the Metropolitan Museum. What we hope is, through our efforts, and I'll show just a couple more examples, is that this is not the best answer. It's one way to approach this issue of repatriation that is, we're starting to hear more and more about. This is, we think, is one way to get the conversation going, so that eventually the pressure, the incentives will be there for these museums to start returning things to where they were looted from. This is obvious. We know that this went out of the country illegally. Metropolitan, if they would have done a little bit more due diligence, they would not have this in their collection. So here's another example. Again, from looking at the recordings from the 1960s, we saw, okay, well, that was in the site in the 1960s. Well, it's actually on the cover of something produced by ICOM, International Council of Museums, on their red list of looted rock art. And it is in the Quai Branly Museum in Paris. And again, I could say they're gracious enough to let us come in, do 3D scanning. We did a small model. When we went back, we showed that to the chief and we said, would it mean anything if we recreated this monolith for you and for the community? He's like, yes, please. So we did that. We came back in 2020 with a real life recreation of that monolith, handed it over. These are the 6 area chiefs when we handed it over. And no, it's made of this. We've made it from like a fiberglass. Yeah, but we have in other cases, we have used the stone to recreate that. Okay, sorry you can't hear, but you can get an idea anyway. This is the celebration. So the community was truly thrilled. It's a reproduction, but it still had meaning for them. And again, our hope is that this is part of the dialogue to convince the Quai Branly to give back that monolith. It was stone. So if you remember the Biafra War in Nigeria in the 1960s, the civil war in Nigeria, so a time of confusion, and people take advantage of that to take things out of the country when nobody's paying attention, nobody's looking. So that's probably, maybe it was even somebody from the community who sold it, for whatever meaning, but probably not the whole community benefited from whatever the $1,000 that was maybe somebody paid, or $500 that somebody paid for that particular stone. Okay, well, I thought I had another example, but let me just talk. So, again, I talk about starting a conversation, and there is the Chrysler Museum in Virginia. We discovered that they had a monolith, again, another one that was looted, and we approached them, Factum Foundation. I have to give them the credit here. They said, listen, Chrysler, if we give you a beautiful reproduction of that monolith, would you agree to give back the original to the community? And they agreed to that. So and what they're able to do, they're able to say, look, we're on the right side of history. They did an exhibition about the whole issue of looted heritage and so on. So, it puts them in a good light. And so this is, we hope that can be a model for this type.
Well, so this talking about so one image is I show the work that there is working on restaurant and walk on it. Do we have 60,000 images from walk in 20 countries? 25,000 of those images are available at versions in part of this collection of 20 of images. I guess funny shows a little bit more about that. So it's really quite impressive. He goes and there's to see all this hiking. So after walk around, take me to the site. We need to look at those 25,000 images, like the my engaging. They've created some wonderful videos, some Ireland. William Museum of it is. So it's a real good mission. So my last slide is the video. I'm going to go ahead and call it 30. My visitation, walk up this town. It's meaningful, it's beautiful. This is something we do have to pay there while we to Israel. But then you do what?
And so here's my contact. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And obviously, I don't know if you have time for questions now, but I'm happy to.
Is the bottleneck